Good morning. My name is David Hayes. I teach and work at Coe College here in Cedar Rapids. Very happy to be with you this morning. Going to try to offer to share just a few brief thoughts and maybe a little speculation about privacy law and how it might adapt to make each of our lives a little more full and protected as we grow into this digital world that we're all learning about through this series, and how it changes some areas of our lives, such as privacy. So just in a real broad way, if we talk about a right to privacy, I think a lot of us feel that that is an inherent right that we all carry around with us, and it's something that we should vigorously protect when we have the opportunity to stand up for it. Curiously, it's not included as a enumerated right in the United States Constitution. We can find kernels of it in the Fourth Amendment and in the Ninth Amendment. We certainly find an extension of privacy in the 14th Amendment when we apply the federal Constitution to the states. But there's not a clear-cut, here's your right to privacy stated clearly and succinctly in the federal Constitution, and the same applies to most state constitutions, not all, but most. However, I think if you stop somebody walking down the street and say, hey, do you have some sort of right to be left alone, where people can't intrude upon what you think is your private life, most people would say, absolutely, it's a fundamental right. It makes me an autonomous, free individual. We should protect it. I'll also note that under international law, under treaties, we do recognize the right to privacy under the ICCPR, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That's oftentimes cited, Article 17 of that convention, when discussing privacy laws here in the United States. So if we understand that we've got this broad conception of what privacy might be, we value it, I think we then have to acknowledge it's gotten a whole lot harder to hold on to that privacy over the last several decades, as we've seen this growth in all things digital and the ability for actors to get lots of data and information about our lives that they just simply couldn't have access to previously. And the reason they're getting that information is we find great value in the sharing of that information if it's used in the right way. So that's the kind of the paradox here, is we want people to know some things about ourselves so that it can be used to help us, but we don't want that same information to be turned against us in such a way that it is used to do us harm or limit our freedom and autonomy and choice in other matters. So what's interesting here is the law has been pretty slow in keeping up and helping keep on top of the rapid and accelerating change in all things digital, particularly as it relates to our rights as consumers when dealing in commercial transactions, and our rights as individuals within governments to protect our personal freedoms. One quick example that you've all run into, a very expensive effort from the European Union expressed in something called the GDPR, which had all kinds of rules about email, the storage of those emails, options to opt out of the information collection related to all those emails, so on and so forth, requirements of United States companies, including most of the places you all work, to have information officers, things of this nature, an incredibly expensive undertaking that came from us and our friends over in Europe. You can't put your finger on a lot of tangible good that has come in each and every one of our lives because of that rather expansive law. I think it did certainly bring more awareness to many of us about the type of information that was being collected, but almost everyone opts in when given an option to do so related to email information collecting, things like cookies and tracking and that type of stuff on websites. It makes your access to information easier and more convenient. Most people don't give it a thought when they read some sort of user agreement. They just click in and keep plowing away. So it's hard to know exactly what nut to crack when you're trying to do legislation in this area. And then the final thing that makes the law struggle in this area, it's evolving so rapidly. 10 years ago, most of us could not have predicted how companies would be using information and data to both improve our lives and, in some cases, work against us by knowing a little bit more about us than what we maybe would have anticipated. When we first all started sharing emails and contact lists, when you were at the state fair and you could sign up to win a free car and everybody plopped down their email, I don't think most of us fully anticipated that 20 years later there would be this huge stew of information gathered from a ton of different sources, put into incredibly huge databases with supercomputers that can chunk out information about me that I probably don't even know about my own self. That's continuing to happen. What you and I do today will have some sort of application 20 plus years from now that we really can't fully understand today. The rate of evolution, innovation, and exploration as it relates to data is really mind-boggling. And we don't really know what the end game looks like. We're telling a joke and we haven't even begun to consider the punchline. It's a very tough thing to regulate today when we don't really know how the whole game is going to be played. So it presents a lot of problems. And we live in a hyper-connected, globalized world, which means this is not just a localized problem. This becomes an issue of international law. And we are transmitting we're transmitting information about ourselves in a decidedly non-private way that allows a lot of different actors around the globe to have access to what in the past was very, very private and limited in terms of what we would share. So the reason we're doing this, of course, is we have to, if we're going to participate in the modern economy and, in many ways, modern society. It's hard to be a fully functioning social actor and not have some sort of digital footprint that you have willingly left behind. So we know this information gets used. I believe you've had some other speakers talk about how commercialized this information has become. And it's really fascinating in a number of interesting ways. Big data is a phrase that gets kicked around all the time. Big data allows us to find patterns and correlations in huge bits of information of past behavior, where we can find lessons in that behavior to predict future behavior with some other tools and whatnot thrown in there as well. The first time I ran into how this could be used, that caused me to kind of go, whoa. I heard of in a business journal years and years ago that one of the major retailers had figured out from looking at sales on around hurricanes that they would be able to sell more lumber. No surprise there. I think each of us could have figured that out. But they also picked up on a tick in some consumer items that they hadn't anticipated. One of the best-selling items for this particular retailer on the front end of a hurricane turned out to be Pop-Tarts. Go figure. So what do you do if you're that retailer? Well, you buy more Pop-Tarts when you see hurricane season coming, or if you see a forecast of bad weather. That way you don't run out of that inventory, and you probably crowd out something else in the store because you know people will be buying those Pop-Tarts. It's a larger question if you use price discrimination to maybe raise the price of those Pop-Tarts just a fraction because you're meeting an increased demand. At any rate, when I read that, I thought that's really different. It's all sensible. It's something that each and every one of us would try to do to find that advantage in the way we present a product in the market. However, some part of that is taking advantage of how you and I behave during our lives and using it for a commercial advantage. A lot of folks might be uncomfortable with that, or at least want to try to keep some constraints on it. You add to that AI and algorithms and machine learning, and people will be able to figure out more about who we are and how we act than we might be able to do for ourselves. It will also allow cross-platform understanding of this information in such a way that different sectors whom we never shared our information with will be able to take advantage of that information in ways that might be good or bad. So let's talk about the bad. Really, we have three actors out there who could take our private information that's been shared in a digitalized way and do things that we don't particularly like. The first, of course, is our own governments. We've seen some activity here that I think is troubling to every individual and every citizen. We certainly know that the National Security Agency is collecting information that might surprise some of us. The Snowden release shared many of those concerns in a very public way. We've had all kinds of reports from around the world about other governments using data in a way that I think gives us pause. One of the big changes is the use of cell phone location. That's new in the last decade or so in terms of how frequent each of us has every move we make from a geographic standpoint covered and recorded. We know that cell phone information has been used to monitor protests and allow police to respond to those protests in a way that they were sort of ahead of the protesters. That should give all of us pause, and we should think through what the implications of that type of use of data might be. We've already talked a little bit about commercial operators. Lots of businesses, nonprofits, organizations use targeted marketing and other strategies that rely on your data to make better decisions about how they bring a product to you. And then there are bad actors out there. We've all heard the stories. We've all seen the examples. Maybe you've had some of this in your own life. But we have people who hack into this information when it's stored by the first two actors and use it for bad purposes. It might be a direct release of that information, or it might be trying to freeze that information and use it against us in some sort of ransom type environment. And obviously, that's an international concern. One of the things that is very different about privacy in a digitalized world is my life in Cedar Rapids, Iowa can be exposed by somebody sitting in Russia in a way that probably couldn't have happened 50 years ago, and that's a very difficult thing for the law to respond to. When you have to introduce international coordination in enforcement and shared norms, we all know we've seen that break down a little bit over the last 10 years anyway. This makes for a really tough sandbox to play in terms of how we're going to enforce whatever legal regime we come up with. So, data is making our lives better because we've got good things happening that this data in these collected ways helps with, while at the same time compromising privacy. The good part of all this is it is helping us to make decidedly better decisions, even when we don't realize that it is helping us make those better decisions. AI and the algorithms are really good at making choices for me based upon my preferences expressed in prior behavior. And we do know that you can tell a lot about somebody's next decision based upon how they've behaved in the past. So to the extent this information is being channeled to reduce the decisions that I have to make for myself in an autonomous way, I've got more bandwidth upstairs to worry about other decisions in life, and I've had a few things taken off the table in a way that actually provides utility to me. This is also driving huge innovation, which is really startling when you think about how much is changing in the digitalized space across all platforms, and really good things continue to happen with the use of data. We have the ability to greatly increase our understanding of a whole range of problems because of data and the tools that we've developed to slice and dice and understand human behavior better. If you think of healthcare and the ability for us to pull a lot of information together through models and research, we can better solve disease, illness, etc. in a much more efficient, much faster, much more direct way. and we can actually make that information actionable in a way that we weren't able to do 20 years ago. If you look forward 10 years, people talk about how your smartwatch is going to be able to provide biometric information real time and continuously. It won't be too long before the items you're searching for on your internet, if you put the right health terms in that, if you have the right email exchange with your doctor, and then you have the right thing tick on your Apple Watch, a computer will put those three things together, and it might diagnose some sort of ailment that you have, or even save your life by recognizing that you're having a trauma in your own personal health life and get you some help. And so the reason we will continue to give up this space of autonomy is good things happen. It has made a net positive for most of us, even though we're well aware of all the bads that are out there. I think we all focus on the hacks and that type of thing. There are some other real concerns if we allow too much intrusion into our data. For example, if we're relying on the past, every sort of troubling thing that has existed throughout our society will be encapsulated in that data. So if you think of discrimination, if you think of bias, if you think of inequality, all that is reflected in the data that these decisions of the future will be based upon if we continue to rely on the predictive nature of big data and other techniques. It's very historical, and therefore it doesn't necessarily project where we want to get to in terms of our society. Finally, I'd offer one other concern, if you'll allow an economist just to deviate a little bit from what you're maybe interested in. I think one of the real challenges in this area, we like to think of contract law as working best when both sides have full and complete information and where both have equal bargaining strength. If you think of the classes you took that talked about monopolies and why monopolies might be a social bad that we should try to regulate, the same thing happens when I go to negotiate a contract. We have hit a point where one party to that negotiation has far superior information than me as a consumer. They've got the big computer, they've got all the data, they've got the research, they've got all the data scientists working in their corporation. They know exactly what my preferences are in a way that gives them unilateral bargaining strength in the way they approach that transaction. We're going to see more and more of that, where as individuals, the people we're relying on in commerce are just going to be able to game the system in a way that every advantage that could be bargained for in that contract exchange is going to go to the larger entity who's more sophisticated in the world of data. So the other thing I think we need to worry about as the law looks to evolve here is we'll call it kind of the second order aggregated information. All this information has been stewed together, and we're now finding new ways to use the big amalgamated pot of data. All that little bit of privacy that we've given up in very discrete, isolated incidents has now been linked and bundled in such a way that new information can be gleaned about us that we never intended to share. You can very well figure out what someone's political ideology is by just looking at their data footprint. If they've ordered a button for a particular candidate online, and if we pull that to their phone data of attending a speech at a rally somewhere, we absolutely know what that person's political leanings are. If we're in an environment where that information is intentionally misused to suppress some sort of anti-government protest, it's very easy to connect the dots about how that information will be misused in a way that is hostile to our democracy. That second order aggregated information is a little bit what I want to talk about next, because we don't have a good way to use that right, or to police that right now in terms of the law. Some of the challenges there. First and foremost, the law is 4 or 5 years behind technology in almost every application that we've seen over the last 20, 25 years. If you pull out a law review article over the last 20 years about anything related to technology, it is amazing how we as legal writers are always behind where the real world is at the time that law review comes out. We're always identifying a solution to a problem that was 5 years ago, and we've missed the forest through the trees in terms of where the technology is taking society. It's hard to keep up in a rapidly evolving environment. It's instantly international, as I talked about before, so any legal right and regime has to take into account a huge number of actors. That complicates things. I think there's a real interesting legal question related to minors. One of the great things in our country is we give protection to kids and allow them to be kids. A minor has a right to be a minor. A decision you make as a 9-year-old is obviously not something that you should carry the same responsibility for when you make that decision as a 29-year-old. If I do dumb things in the digital world, I've given up a lot of privacy that I may never recover, even though I was a minor at the time. So I think all of this needs to have some sort of ability for a kid to be a kid. And then finally, there's the commercial reality of the collection of this information. We need for that to continue, and I'm more than happy to give you some of my information if I know what the trade-offs are long term. I don't want to cough up something today that will be used against me in an unexpected way for which I don't have any control or any ability to consent to. So, in just one very small area of how we might try to organize our regulation of this sharing of privacy, let's consider what the trade-offs are of how we're presenting our private information to the larger world through this data collection, and maybe come up with a proposal about how to pull this off, right? So if we maybe go to the law in a much older setting, I think we can find some lessons that would help us consider what we might do here. This is not the first time we've become less private. If you can imagine 200 years ago, before the invention of photography, your likeness was not something that had ever been captured. Our great-great-grandfathers and mothers never had to worry about somebody taking a picture of them on a cell phone and blasting that out. They didn't even have to worry about a picture. The law had to confront how someone can use a picture of a private individual for purposes that work against that individual. So we can go back to tort law, which is, as most of you know, the common law. It's the law that's been created through our courts and our judges as compared to legislative law. Our early common law recognized something that we call a tort. A tort is a civil wrong. It's a duty where somebody has a duty to behave in a certain way with responsibility to others. And if that legal duty is breached, meaning it's not carried out to an appropriate standard, and that breach causes injury to another person, the law will entitle you to an action against that person to address that wrong. In Iowa, even though we don't have the right to privacy under our Constitution, our courts have recognized a limited right to privacy as a matter of common law tort. It's very interesting. We've recognized that even though it's a qualified right, not absolute, I do have some right to privacy in Iowa under the common law. So for example, there's an old case of a tragic case involving a young child who had been killed. Photographer took a picture of the body after it had been found. The body had been out in the field for some period of time, so you can imagine it was a gruesome picture. Not something most of us would want to have shared if it was one of our loved ones. That photo was shared in a newspaper, and the family challenged that, sued, saying you've done harm to us because of the publishing of what should have been a private photo. And the court had to balance the right to privacy. Most of us would not want such a photo published of a loved one against the public's interest in knowing. Now, the public does have an interest in this case. It's no longer a purely private situation because it has involved a public crime. We all have an interest in finding out what's going on, learning more, and bringing someone to justice because we all need to feel safe in our own lives. So the court entered into a balancing that said whenever we look at right to privacy and a potential breach of that through tort, we have to balance that against the possible public benefit of knowing the private act. That's what we do in tort law, is we balance the possible good against the possible bad. If you're an economist, you would look at this as what's the private utility gain through the privacy against the public utility and benefit for having that information shared. We then have to speculate a little bit further about that balancing and recognize we don't have full information today about how that information will be used. And so here I'd like to introduce another tort, which we call the misappropriation of the right to publicity. This particular tort says that if you're going to use a private likeness, image, or identity, usually for commercial gain, you can only do so with permission or license. So if I go in and have my photo taken as a part of a commercial shoot, I have to sign off on the use of my face before you can put it on a product to sell more of it. And certainly that would be worth a lot of value if you had my mug on whatever you were trying to sell. Some of you might remember a coffee brand called Taster's Choice and the labeling that it had on its coffee can. It was a close-up of a face sniffing a cup of coffee, a little bit of steam coming up, made it look like it was the most tasty cup of coffee you could ever start your morning with. In a really fascinating turn of events, Taster's Choice actually got sued in 2005 over the use of that photo. It had been their marketing standard for years, and they never had permission to use the face of the model in that marketing. There was a mix-up where this gentleman had taken some pictures in a product shoot. They had never gotten him to sign off on it. Several years later, they found that photo as a part of a review of some files. They said this would work great. They never followed up to make sure that they had consent and license to use that photo. They put it out on the cans, so millions and millions of dollars worth of coffee, and then this gentleman one day sees his face, somehow recognizes it as him, and sues Taster's Choice for the use of his image without permission. He received something like $15 million in a jury trial for the misappropriation of his image. Now, without getting too far in the specifics of that case and if it was correctly decided, let's pull one thing from that. That's the sharing of a likeness that then gets misused years later. That's the situation we're all going to be in. We need to be able to share our information today with a little bit of faith that it's not going to be misused 5, 10, 20 years from now as we continue to grow in the use of data and the ability for corporations and others to pull all that data together in a way that we hadn't anticipated. So what if we took these understandings of tort law and civil responsibility to one another not to abuse image and privacy and tried to pull it together into something that would balance our right to have our private image shared in a way that does us value and doesn't subject us to future misuse of that image privacy data. If we could agree on the assumptions of how we want that to be used with those trade-offs between the public need and our private right, as we just kind of touched on in those quick examples, if we could all get on a shared page to those assumptions, we could come up with a standard for how the use of that data, the use of that private information, can be used in the larger marketplace. So then perhaps the solution to all of this is actually embedded in the problem creating it. We could use the data itself and all the techniques that have been developed by the big data scientists, the logarithms, the connections, the testing, and use that to police this own area. What we're going to find is that corporations, businesses, partners, or nonprofit partners are going to start to use this information in a way that creates a pattern of behavior, right? We're going to see that pricing out of Pop-Tarts right before a hurricane, we're going to see that exact same phenomenon in ways we can't predict today, but we will see that begin to be a trend in the data if we're watching the actual data. So I think what we could do, get a shared page on the balancing of interests, come up with that criteria, have some sort of actor out in the field that's keeping an eye on that data, and apply the very testing, the very correlation searching that we do in big data, apply those techniques to scout for patterns of misuse. That frees you and me from having to worry about every single time we click I accept when we're trying to purchase something for our house. It allows the marketplace to continue to innovate with a little bit of rules around what that innovation can lead to. And it also has at least the ability to identify what we think is inappropriate behavior that doesn't necessarily advance our own private interests in a way that trumps the public's need to know. Perhaps a non-government entity of some type could be formed to be the person at the switch related to this self-policing. And if we really got going, perhaps it could even be part of an internationalized standard. Many of you know that there's an organization, ICANN, that has been very successful in terms of structuring rules for the larger internet. There might be a way to do some outgrowth from that initiative into this type of area. And then it can get kind of cool, right? So if you're a positivist as you approach the law, where you think there should just be real hard and fast rules, they apply to everyone every time without any deviation. If you could come up with a way for the machines to apply the law against the machines, that might be a pretty cool trick and something to explore for another day. So at any rate, that's just a few thoughts from me today. Absolutely nothing there is maybe certainly coming about, but we do have a situation where we have to share, we have to provide data, but we're all concerned about what's actually being done with that data. Didn't address much about how to protect ourselves from bad actors, as well as governments looking to usurp our identities for bad purposes that are against democracy. Perhaps a topic for another day. Thank you very much. I hope you have a great Sunday.